From the moment the coronavirus started to take root in the U.S., then President Donald Trump continually downplayed the disease, sometimes flat out lying.
Death is way down from where it was.
It's 1,000 a day. It was
Many journalists called out the misinformation, getting the truth out to the public. But that wasn't the case in the worst pandemic in U.S. history.
Refusal to tell the truth killed people. That's the biggest single lesson coming out of 1918.
Between 1918 and 1919, an estimated 675,000 Americans died of influenza.
Well, the pandemic was minimized, much as it has been today. The motive back then, of course, was they were afraid that any negative news would hurt morale and damage the war effort.
In 1918, the U.S. was in the final stretches of World War I. To President Woodrow Wilson, talk of the pandemic was a distraction. Patriotism at all costs was needed to ask Americans to send their boys overseas and send their money. So he assembled a powerful propaganda machine, and it worked.
Newspapers were entirely complicit. They were either intimidated or volunteered.
Some newspapers only covered the war and barely mentioned the pandemic. Others didn't push back when public officials called it ordinary influenza.
It was not ordinary influenza by another name. People could die 12 hours after the first symptoms, bleeding not only from the nose, but from the mouth, from the eyes, from the ears.
On one day alone, the city of Philadelphia lost 769 people to the illness and was in the throes of a second deadly wave. Yet, when the Philadelphia Inquirer came out the next day, it reported, "Philadelphia will soon be out of the clutches of the epidemic influenza."
When they finally belatedly closed theaters, restaurants, schools, and so forth, one of the newspapers actually said, "This is not a public health measure. You have no cause for panic or alarm." People are dying all around you. I mean, really, how stupid did they think people were?
And the Sedition Act of 1918 helped newspapers fall in line with the president's objectives. Now, you could get 20 years in prison if you willfully utter, print, write, or publish anything disloyal about the U.S. government. The publisher of a Wisconsin paper had written an editorial criticizing the military for not doing enough to save soldiers from dying from the disease.
The Army started to prosecute its publisher and editor under the Sedition Act.
The act ended up getting repealed after the war, but the damage had already been done. More Americans ended up dying from the 1918 flu than from the war. In fact, there were more American deaths from the pandemic than in the battles from the Civil War, both World Wars, and Vietnam combined.
And the whole point of the freedom of the press is the freedom to criticize people in power.
Carrie Cochran, Newsy.